Hello, and welcome to Scott's Odyssey. Every generation of United States citizens have experienced a moment due to an atrocity that could never be conceived of happening, where they held their breath because time stood still. An incident that you can remember exactly where you were, what you were doing, and all the sights and smells around you, regardless of how far or near you were to the event that transpired. For my grandparents, it was the bombing of Pearl Harbor on December 7th of 1941. For my parents, it was the assassination of President John Fitzgerald Kennedy on November 22nd of 1963. For my generation, it was the attack on the general population of the United States, with the use of passenger airliners on the World Trade Center, the Pentagon, and a thwarted attack of the U.S. Capitol. Just off the Lincoln Highway, welcome to the Pennsylvania location for the Flight 93 Memorial Battleground. Before we get into this video, I wish to let you know right now, this video is not for the meek and may be very tough to watch for some viewers. I will let you know right now, this story for me is a hard one to tell. Personally, I remember living in Philadelphia as we entered into the post 9/11 world. I know firsthand what it's like to live at the dawn of the 21st century and not see nor hear a single aircraft in the air or car on the road. And I know what it is to watch the world stop turning. And let me tell you, I know what it is to hear the most absolutely frightening and loudest sound you could ever possibly hear. And that's the sound of silence. At the time of this video, it's currently 19 years later, and as I reflect on that fateful day in September of 2001, I realize that the terrorist won, and our country continues to cascade down into the hole they created because we, the modern citizens, are not doing what the passengers of Flight 93 did. We are not fighting back to stop the terrorists, both foreign and more so domestic. Now, without getting into any political agendas, ideological differences, conspiracy theories, and the modern day cognitive dissonance that's plaguing our country, here's the story of Flight 93. A story of real American heroes who would not allow themselves to be subjugated by other people's opinions and beliefs, but instead held true to our founding documents, our freedoms, our liberty, our pursuit of happiness, and fought back, as we should all be doing right now. See you in a minute. Welcome back. If you've watched my videos before, thank you for your patronage, and if you're new to Scott's Odyssey, welcome aboard. And I hope you enjoy this sobering visit to the Flight 93 Memorial and the 35-minute descent into the post 9/11 world. Remember to click like and give me a subscribe in order to receive more stories of who we once were. This video is mostly voiced over due in part to the wind and also in part to the number of times I have to pause and reflect on the events that I'm retelling. The day was Tuesday, September 11th, 2001, and the weather on both the east and west coast was absolutely beautiful, almost exactly as it is today. Mild seasonal temperatures and nearly cloudless skies, especially on the east coast. The early morning Flight 93 out of Newark, New Jersey was on a 41-minute delay due to a long line of almost a dozen aircraft seeking to take advantage of the perfect weather conditions. Something that, although not obvious at first, probably led to this aircraft not reaching its intended target at its intended time. Flight 93 takes off at 8:42 a.m. It's uneventful and begins its non-stop flight from Newark, New Jersey to San Francisco, California. Just 10 minutes before Flight 93's takeoff, NORAD had received word that Flight 11, an aircraft out of Portland International Jetport in Maine, and now flying over Gardner, Massachusetts, destined for Boston, has possibly been hijacked, and they were initiating confirmation on this fact. Just 1 minute after Flight 93's takeoff, NORAD receives word that Flight 175 out of Boston has definitely been hijacked. 1 minute later, all pilots in the airspace over the United States of America are now fully aware that 2 aircraft have been confirmed to have been hijacked. 3 minutes and 11 seconds after the hijacking is radioed out to all pilots, Flight 11, traveling at 470 miles per hour, is flown into One World Trade Center's North Tower. Less than 1 minute later, the United States Secret Service and Brigadier General Montague Winfield, commander of the National Military Command Center in the Pentagon, are brought into an air threat conference call. 1 minute later, national news receives its first reports and immediately airs them on television and radio that there may have been an aircraft crash into the World Trade Center. 11 minutes later, a formal warning is sent out to all United Airlines aircraft that a potential for cockpit intrusion has been determined and that all precautions to barricade the cockpit door is to be initiated. The reasons for this warning and the collision of Flight 11 are not disclosed at this time on the open channels to the pilots. 3 minutes later, Flight 175 crashes into the South Tower of the World Trade Center, while the entire world is watching on live TV. Secret Service agents literally burst into Vice President Dick Cheney's White House office, grab him under his arms, forcing him down to the White House secure bunker. Northeast Air Defense Sector immediately scrambles all home-based fighters into the air with a declaration that our nation is under attack. All radio and television stations immediately turn their music and shows off and begin broadcasting the news for what is happening. 3 minutes later, President Bush is quietly advised of the second aircraft hit on the World Trade Center. National Security Advisor Condoleezza Rice is sent to the White House bunker, at which time both Cheney and Rice are alerted to the fact that Flight 77, destined for Los Angeles, California, has turned around and is now on course to and just 50 miles from Washington, D.C. 9 minutes later, all flights for takeoff are now grounded. 1 minute later, the FAA informs NORAD that Flight 93 may have been hijacked. The terrorists were commandeering aircraft using 5-man teams. Flight 93 only had 4 because one of the terrorists was turned away from the flight by the INS for appearing off-kilter. The one terrorist who was not on the flight was later apprehended in January 2002 on Afghanistan soil and taken to Guantanamo Bay. Although his name was one of the 5 on the list of Gitmo detainees to be released through executive order of President Obama at the end of his term, President Trump rescinded this order, and the terrorist still remains in detention under assertion of being a security risk to the safety of the United States. One of the remaining 4 terrorists was a newer pilot, or at least appeared to be a pilot, and was already in the cockpit of the aircraft, as is the common courtesy of pilots when transporting a fellow pilot from one location to another location from where they would be working. This would also explain why the cockpit would not have been barricaded from the other terrorists, because the cockpit had already been taken over, even though the original pilot and co-pilot were still flying the aircraft. 9 minutes later, Flight 93 checks in with Cleveland Flight Control stating, "Good morning," which was extremely odd and out of protocol based on the current state and levels of security due to what had transpired in the past 40 minutes. 1 minute later, FAA head Jane Garvey initiates a national ground stop, which invokes the FAA's ability to ground all flights and requires all planes in the air to land as soon as possible or reasonable. Around this time, and somewhere between Colebrook and Huntsburg, Ohio, using only knives, the cockpit of Flight 93 is broken into. Several passengers and crew members now lay slain on the aircraft. Using the threat of a bomb being on board the aircraft, all other passengers are forced to the rear of the plane. Now with control of the aircraft, the terrorists make a turn over Cleveland, Ohio, and set a flight heading toward Washington, D.C. 1 minute later, multiple passengers take advantage of the fact that they are all crammed into the rear of the aircraft and use the airphone service to make calls to the authorities, family, and loved ones. There were 37 attempted phone calls. Passenger Tom Burnett calls his wife and tells her his plane has been hijacked. They have already killed people. A bomb is on board, and for her to call the FBI. 1 minute later, due to an open mic in the cockpit, there are audible sounds of a scuffle, a woman screaming, and the terrorists speaking Arabic to each other. 2 minutes later, the FAA Emergency Operations Center is up and running and issue an immediate grounding of all civilian, military, and law enforcement aircraft no longer an as soon as reasonable order, but an immediate grounding. The transponder signal from Flight 93 ceases to broadcast, and radar contact is lost. Although the speed and direction of the aircraft can still be tracked, altitude cannot, and a lot of visual dependence from other aircraft that are landing become the de facto of how we know where the aircraft is. 1 minute later, over Flight 93's cockpit comms can be heard someone telling the flight attendant to sit down, and her response imploring him not to kill her. It is believed she, being the first-class attendant Debbie Welsh, was stabbed during the early part of the takeover. 3 minutes later, one terrorist says over Flight 93's internal audio system that he is the captain, to please sit down, there's a bomb on board, remain seated, and that they are headed back to the airport. At this same time, passenger Tom Burnett calls his wife again and tells her that the terrorists are in the cockpit. The man next to him who was stabbed has no pulse and is now dead, and that these terrorists are on a suicide mission. 2 minutes later, Flight 93 climbs in altitude without authorization and sets a new heading to Washington, D.C. 1 minute later, passenger Jeremy Glick calls his wife and tells her what the terrorists look like: Middle Eastern, Iranian, red headbands, and 3 of them stood up to rush the cockpit. Jeremy Glick, as well as a few of the other passengers in airphone calls, now find out about the World Trade Center Twin Towers. Jeremy Glick leaves his airphone on, and it remains on until the end of the flight. 1 minute later, Flight 77 strikes the Pentagon. At this time, a call from the White House declares the Washington area a free fire zone, meaning the pilots of the military jets were granted open permission to use force if required, whether it meant forcing another aircraft to crash, shooting it down, or sacrificing themselves by crashing into it with their own jets. 3 minutes later, passenger Marion Britton calls a friend and tells him of 2 people being killed. 1 minute later, passenger Mark Bingham calls his mother and lets her know his plane has been hijacked and they have a bomb. 3 minutes later, Tom Burnett makes his 3rd call to his wife, telling her they are going to crash into the Pentagon and he does not think that the bomb is real. 3 minutes later, the passengers in the back perform the foremost American liberty they have, and they actually take a vote on storming the cockpit in order to regain control. Passenger Jeremy Glick relays this information to his wife, and that they have voted to attack the hijackers. 2 minutes later, the Pittsburgh control tower is ordered to be evacuated due to Flight 93 not responding to hails and headed in that direction. 1 minute later, passenger Sandra Bradshaw calls her husband, recounting what has happened on the flight, and that a group of passengers are currently boiling water in the rear galley to use against the hijackers. 3 minutes later, the terrorists are all in the cockpit and afraid that the passengers might retaliate. So one takes up the fire axe and holds it at the peephole in order to scare off any would-be heroes. 1 minute later, Tom Burnett calls his wife for the 4th and final time. He tells his wife that they know they are most likely all going to die, and that they are going to do something about it. Between 9:56 and 9:57 a.m., it's concluded that the overtaking of terrorists from the back of the plane all the way to the cockpit was 100% successful, where they used a food cart as a battering ram and a shield in order to make their way forward. In the flight recordings, the sound of a scuffle, jiggling and breaking glass within a cart, and the hijackers discussing fighting going on outside of the cockpit and discussing the shutting off of the air supply to the plane led confirmation to this theory. Just a minute later, over passenger Todd Beamer's airphone is heard another scuffle, a woman screaming, "Oh my God," and "God help us," with the final words of Tom Beamer being, "Are you ready, guys? Let's roll." Flight attendant C.C. Lyles tells her husband, "It feels like the plane's going down. I think they're going to do it. They're forcing their way into the cockpit. They're doing it. They're doing it." Passenger Sandy Bradshaw tells her husband, "Everyone is running to first class. I've got to go. Bye." The next 4 minutes of recording hear silence from the back of the plane, then some screaming, then more silence, then the sound of the aircraft connecting with the ground at 10:03 and 11 seconds on September 11th, 2001. During those last 4 minutes,
Numerous witness accounts of the aircraft flying down really low, just above the treetops, wobbling around sporadically, turning upside down for a minute or two, and then finally crashing have been told by locals. All of them describe the incident exactly the same way. According to forensics, the fast altitude drop combined with some sporadic air maneuvers caused the aircraft to start breaking apart at about 10 a.m., as proven by pieces of the aircraft found miles before the location of the crash site, in turn causing a total and catastrophic loss of maneuverability. In the end, Flight 93 connected with the Earth at a speed of 563 miles per hour, leaving behind a large 40-foot deep crater shaped like the aircraft. And of the 154 feet long aircraft, most of it was reduced into debris with an average size of 2 by 2 inches, and a few of the larger pieces only 6 feet by 7 feet. I will not be providing any of the audio recordings in this video. Many are available online and even at the Flight 93 Memorial site. But we will go through the memorial site. When you arrive, the first thing you will see is the Flight 93 Tower of Voices, nearly 3 miles away from the memorial. The world's tallest wind chime. At 93 feet tall is a tower with 40 wind chimes, each with a different tone, representing the voices on the wind of the fallen passengers and crew members. The Shadow Walk leads you to the entrance of the Memorial Plaza and Visitors Center. The black was chosen to represent the shadow of Flight 93 and the area's native coal heritage. The angles cut in the stone are to represent the branches of the eastern hemlock that took the blow of the aircraft as it came back to Earth. The large concrete walls are also patterned with hand-hewn hemlock wood, which surrounds this area of Pennsylvania. The walls are designed to block your view from everything but the final flight path of Flight 93. The 1/4 mile walk to the Wall of Names travels along the final flight path and acts as a demarcation point of the 40-acre crash site and debris field. The former crater of the impact site is now backfilled and marked with a large 17-ton sandstone boulder. The impact site was backfilled when the determination by the coroner was that less than 8% of the passengers and crew remains were recoverable. So it marks this field as a mass grave to the heroes of Flight 93. The black benches are tapered like airplane wings. The white marble wall is a series of individual stones, each with one name of the 40 passengers and crew of Flight 93, keeping them both as individuals and as the collective group who fought back against the terrorists. A rugged, rough-hewn gate entering the field of impact represents the strength and resolve of the passengers and crew, and the only people permitted beyond this gate are surviving family members of the passengers and crew of Flight 93. The Wetlands Bridge is a walking bridge that connects the alley walkway to the Memorial Plaza. The 1-mile alley walk is as its name states, an alley or a tree-lined walkway that is designed to create a focal point at the end of the path. The western overlook is where the families of the passengers and crew gathered at the site just days after the attack. The alley walkway follows the memorial groves, which have 40 memorial groves, each planted with 40 native Pennsylvania trees, consisting of eastern hemlock, white pine, black cherry, sugar maple, black locust, white oak, hickory, silky dogwood, elderberry, and American chestnuts. Over 150,000 trees planted in this living tribute to the passengers and crew of Flight 93.
Although this site has now been memorialized, it's imperative to remember what happened on that fateful day. Our core values and beliefs were attacked, and 2,977 people were murdered, as well as over 6,000 people seriously injured because someone else wanted to push their beliefs upon us. Today in the United States, we have another situation tearing apart our country from the inside, and our liberties are being challenged and attacked on a daily basis. If you have any takeaway or inspiration from this video, let it be this. We, as citizens of the United States of America, need to remember who we once were, and that the price of our freedom and liberty is eternal vigilance. Be like the American heroes of Flight 93, and let's roll.